The Russia-Ukraine war appears to have become a war of attrition, and the question is whether either of the players will do something in coming weeks, maybe at the one-year anniversary point, to change the game. Russia has been the driving force to date, and I think its choices are basically to do something to get tired of the West sending weapons to Ukraine, tanks, and maybe in the future even planes, and make it more painful for the West, or to double down on hurting Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, or maybe to look for a way to climb down, which is unlikely, of course, even though logic points to that as something that would be in Russia's interest.
Not providing weapons for Ukraine, which we need to win this war this year, it's escalatory, and it creates a lot of problems like inflation, global hunger threat, nuclear security issues. And I do believe that Japan, during its presidency in G7 and during G7 summit in Hiroshima, will raise the issue of nuclear safety and demilitarization of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant as a key priority, and also defending freedom of navigation in the Black Sea, that we could export Ukraine grain worldwide.
Hannah, I absolutely agree that there is a tremendous interest on the part of the West in making clear that authoritarian regimes that are aggressive towards their neighbors cannot and should not prosper. That's obvious. But there's another interest, which is avoiding World War III. And the fact is that Putin's regime is somewhat inscrutable. We don't know what they might do. And there's a delicate balance at play here. That is why the West has been put in a somewhat undignified position of appearing to hedge. And I have a lot of sympathy for people like Biden, because I'm not sure what I would do. It's easy to sit here in the studio and say that Russia must be defeated, but if the consequence of that is nuclear war in Western Europe, then maybe that's not the best idea. It is still conceivable, not likely, I'm not predicting this, but it is conceivable that other things might happen that do not appear to be probable right now. Maybe regime change in Russia. That probably is the best thing. Maybe some kind of compromise involving a slight come down by Ukraine under certain circumstances. Maybe where Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union on a fast track. One can conceive of more creative options than merely going for total victory against a potentially maniacal dictator who could be out of control. I'm saying we have to be wise and not just right.
Go ahead.
Okay, go.
Hannah, yours.
Okay.
Go ahead, Hannah.
Being wise, it means to learn the lessons from history. The Soviet Union disintegration in 1991 for Putin was the biggest geopolitical catastrophe, but for nations in Eastern and Central Europe was the biggest success.
Yeah, I don't think we can convince Putin. That's clear. But we do want to avoid World War III. We do want Ukraine to remain independent and strong. We want Ukraine to prosper after the war, and we should help rebuild Ukraine for sure. But the question now is how, perhaps, to avoid a further escalation that could widen the war. And that is why they're hesitating to give Ukraine F-16s. There's simply no doubt about that. And alongside being an activist and saying how bad Putin is, that's easy. We should maybe also try to achieve the harder thing, which is to figure out how we end this war, which, by the way, even if Ukraine wins, costs Ukrainian lives with every day that passes.
Joel, let's hear what you have to say.
I'm a pessimist. I've been in Berlin and also in Italy for most of the war. I'm a Berlin resident, and I have seen, things only escalate from my distant perspective.
Is Russia losing support on the home front? Dan, what do you think?
There's a great line in Breakfast of Champions by Kurt Vonnegut that says, "In nonsense is strength." And Putin is not the first world leader to attempt to rule by that maxim. The idea being that you can manipulate the people through propaganda and lies and machinations. And I think the Russian public is in a difficult position, but they face a very major test. And there are signs that, indeed, opinion is turning against Putin. Well, I think this is a case where the elite in Russia may be a vanguard. We see what's happening in signs that exist. For example, a talk of forbidding officials from traveling abroad. And of course, the fact that many Russians, many of whom work for high-tech companies, entire companies, when they could, relocated not only to places in the West or to the Baltics, but even to Georgia and Armenia and also Israel. I think these are signs that Russian people who are able to get information beyond state propaganda, and that obviously does not include rural and distant areas, do understand what's going on. And that sets up a situation in Russia not unfamiliar from other parts of the world, where there will be conflict potentially between so-called elites and regular people in towns and villages.
Every inch of Ukraine should be free from Russian occupiers. So I think the more successes we have at the battlefield, then the situation, first, we have to defeat Russia. Then
Hannah,
we should start
I have to say, we've discussed this, you and I, before on this show. I really just have to ask you a yes or no question, okay? If your choice was between giving up Luhansk and Donetsk, okay, or parts of them, and ending the war, or fighting on for another 3 years, which do you choose? I understand about the danger of appeasing a dictator. I've said this to you before. But if those are your choices and you had to choose, gun to your head, what do you choose?
Look, I used to chair the Foreign Affairs Committee. After 8 years of peaceful settlement of Russian aggression, 8 years of all attempts to use political diplomatic ways, we ended up with genocide. So actually, we cannot trade betray our people living in Lugansk and Donetsk or in Crimea, because what's happening in the occupied territories is a genocide. Only full restoration of territorial integrity in internationally recognized borders of 1991. This is the way to go for all international community.
So your choice is two. Your choice is the second choice, to fight on for another 3 years, have another 250,000 people die in order to not betray the Ukrainians in eastern Ukraine. Is that it?
All right, we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you very much. We're out of time, but definitely not out of passion today. I want to thank our panelists today, Hannah Hopko, former member of Ukrainian Parliament, Dan Perry, international affairs analyst and former Europe editor for the Associated Press, and, of course, Joel Shalit, editor-in-chief at The Battleground. We're going out for a quick break, but